February 25, 1955. 2:17 a.m. Rudow District, American Sector, West Berlin. The temperature had dropped to -4 degrees Celsius. Carl Nelson's breath hung in the air of the warehouse basement like smoke signals. Each exhalation was visible under the single, naked bulb that swung on its cord. He could hear the electrical hum of the refrigeration units above. This was the cover story, a legitimate food processing facility. Beneath that he heard something else, the rhythmic scrape and thud of men working 3 stories underground. Nelson wore 2 wool sweaters beneath his United States Army Corps of Engineers jacket. However, the cold still found its way through. It was a damp cold, an earth cold. This was the kind that settled into your bones and stayed there. He checked his wristwatch again. The luminous hands showed 17 minutes past 2. In 13 minutes, the graveyard shift would break through into East Berlin territory. Technically, they had already been under East German soil for 3 weeks. However, tonight was different. They would reach the junction point, the exact location where Soviet military telephone cables ran beneath Schönefelder Chaussee. These cables carried every classified communication between Moscow and its forward command posts in East Germany. Something felt wrong. Nelson could not identify it exactly. Perhaps it was the way the newest engineer, Dmitry Polyakov, kept glancing toward the stairwell. His papers said he was a Ukrainian refugee cleared by West German intelligence. Perhaps it was the sound itself, the hollow echo that seemed different tonight. It was as if the earth ahead was already disturbed and already waiting. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Maybe it was the creeping realization, like groundwater through limestone, that they had been digging for 7 months. Not a single East German patrol had investigated. Not one probe. Not one suspicious border guard with a listening device pressed to the frozen ground. In the American intelligence community, they called the tunnel Operation Gold. Central Intelligence Agency Director Alan Dulles had personally approved the budget. $6.7 million were allocated for construction. Another $18 million were for the electronic intercept equipment being installed by United States Army Signal Corps specialists. British Secret Intelligence Service called their part of it Operation Stopwatch. Together, the Anglo-American team had designed the most ambitious peacetime espionage operation in history. This was a 1,500-foot tunnel stretching from West Berlin into the heart of Soviet-controlled territory. It was intended to tap directly into the communication arteries of the Red Army. But standing in that basement, watching his breath crystallize, Nelson felt the weight of something he could not name. This was the kind of weight that comes before revelation. It comes before everything you believe inverts like a photograph in developing fluid. He descended the aluminum ladder into the shaft, his boots finding the rungs by memory. Below him, the tunnel stretched toward the border like an accusation. It was like a secret that was never really secret at all. And in Moscow, in a filing cabinet in the Soviet State Security Committee headquarters on Lubyanka Square, there was already a file. It was labeled Operation Gold American Tunnel. The file had been opened in December 1953. This was 14 months before the first shovel broke ground in Rudow. Inside were blueprints, personnel lists, and a handwritten note from Colonel Sergei Kondrashev. The note instructed them not to interfere and to monitor the operation. It also stated to expose it when operationally advantageous. The operation that the Central Intelligence Agency believed was their greatest triumph was, from its inception, the Soviet State Security Committee's greatest deception. The idea first took shape in London in November 1951. This occurred in a second-floor office at Military Intelligence, Section 6 headquarters overlooking the Thames. George Blake, a Secret Intelligence Service officer, sat across from Peter Lunn, the head of the Berlin station. Blake had recently returned from communist imprisonment in Korea. Blake was 30 years old and darkly handsome. He had the slight formality of manner common to British intelligence officers who had come up through wartime service. He had been captured in Korea in 1950. He then spent 3 years in a prisoner of war camp. According to his debriefers, he emerged unbroken. What those debriefers did not know was that George Blake had converted to Soviet ideology during his captivity. They could not possibly know that before returning to London, Blake had made contact with Soviet handlers. He offered them something unprecedented. This was complete access to every British intelligence operation he encountered. Peter Lunn was explaining the Berlin problem. The city had become the front line of the intelligence war. West Berlin was a democratic island surrounded by communist territory. It served as the staging ground for Central Intelligence Agency and military intelligence, Section 6 operations into the Soviet bloc. However, gathering intelligence was maddeningly difficult. Human agents were risky. Soviet counterintelligence was devastatingly effective. What they needed, Lunn explained, was a way to intercept Soviet communications directly. The Americans had done it before in Vienna, tapping Soviet landlines. But Vienna was different. In Berlin, the cables ran underground, deep beneath the border fortifications. Blake listened carefully. He took notes. He asked technical questions about cable locations, tunnel feasibility, and security protocols. He was, after all, a secret intelligence service officer doing his job. On December 28, 1951, Blake met his Soviet handler Nikolai Rodin in a safe house in the Netherlands. He brought with him everything Lunn had discussed. This included details of the preliminary survey work. Military intelligence, Section 6, had begun. The Soviets were immediately interested, but cautious. The idea was still preliminary. They would wait. The operation accelerated in 1953 when Alan Dulles became Director of Central Intelligence. Dulles had spent World War II running Office of Strategic Services operations in Switzerland. There he had developed a taste for bold, technically complex espionage. When Central Intelligence Agency Berlin Station Chief Bill Harvey briefed him on the tunnel concept, Dulles recognized its potential immediately. This was not just intelligence collection, it was psychological warfare. Imagine the Soviet military conducting its most sensitive communications. They would be unaware that every word was being intercepted, transcribed, and analyzed by American intelligence. The strategic advantage would be incalculable. Harvey was the perfect man to oversee it. He was 40 years old, a former Federal Bureau of Investigation agent. He had transferred to the Central Intelligence Agency after a jurisdictional dispute with J. Edgar Hoover. He had a reputation for drinking too much, speaking bluntly, and executing operations with methodical precision. He also had a particular hatred for the Soviet State Security Committee. This hatred was born from years of watching Soviet intelligence outwit American agents across Europe. Harvey saw the tunnel as his chance to turn the tables definitively. The British were brought in because they had better intelligence on cable locations. Their Signals Intercept Unit had been mapping Soviet communications infrastructure in Berlin since 1945. The partnership was formalized in 1954. British Secret Intelligence Service would provide technical expertise and cable intelligence. The Central Intelligence Agency would provide funding, construction capability, and the intercept equipment. They would share the intelligence product equally. George Blake was assigned as the Secret Intelligence Service Liaison Officer to the Planning Committee. In March 1954, Blake attended a joint Central Intelligence Agency and Secret Intelligence Service planning conference. This took place at Mount Royal, a Central Intelligence Agency facility in Maryland. Over 3 days, the full operational plan was laid out before him. This included the exact tunnel location and the engineering specifications. The expected start date was September 1954. They also discussed the type of intercept equipment to be installed and the cover story. The cover story was a United States Army Signal Corps radar installation and warehouse. Blake took meticulous notes. He photographed documents. He memorized organizational charts. On April 19, 1954, Blake met with his Soviet State Security Committee handler in a West Berlin safe house. He delivered everything. His handler was Sergei Kondrashev, a sophisticated Soviet State Security Committee officer. Kondrashev understood immediately what he was holding. This was not just an intelligence leak. This was an opportunity to run a strategic deception operation at scale. If handled correctly, they could turn Operation Gold into a weapon against the West. Kondrashev flew to Moscow the next day. Within 1 week, the file reached the desk of Soviet State Security Committee Chairman Ivan Serov. Serov convened a meeting of the Operational Directorate. They met to decide how to handle the information. They faced a genuine dilemma. They could simply arrest the tunnel diggers the moment they crossed into East German territory. This would be a propaganda coup. However, it would also expose Blake, their most valuable agent in place, or they could interfere subtly. They could move the cables, reroute communications, and deprive the Americans of useful intelligence. But that might signal to the Central Intelligence Agency that they had a leak in their planning committee. The decision they reached was audacious. They decided to do nothing. They would let the Americans build their tunnel. They would let them tap the cables. They would let them believe they were winning. However, they would carefully control what information flowed through those cables. They would use the Central Intelligence Agency's tunnel to feed them exactly what Moscow wanted them to know. They would also protect Blake at all costs. An agent with access to Anglo-American planning was worth more than any tactical advantage from shutting down the tunnel. On May 2, 1954, Serov sent a coded message to Soviet military command in East Germany. The message stated that the American tunnel operation was authorized. It instructed them not to interfere and to continue normal communications protocols. It also said that special traffic would be flagged for tunnel diversion. In practice, this meant that truly sensitive Soviet communications would not be intercepted by the tunnel. These included operational orders for Soviet State Security Committee illegals in the West, nuclear weapons data, and genuine military planning. Such communications would be sent via couriers, one-time pad radio transmissions, or cables that ran through alternate routes. The tunnel would receive a carefully curated diet of real but non-critical military traffic. This was mixed with strategic deception material designed to mislead Western intelligence about Soviet capabilities and intentions. The irony was perfect. The Central Intelligence Agency was about to spend $25 million to build the Soviet State Security Committee's private disinformation channel. Construction began on September 2, 1954. The warehouse in Rudo was real. Enough. It actually processed and stored food for the United States military commissary system. But beneath it, Army Corps of Engineers specialists began sinking a vertical shaft 50 feet into the Berlin clay. The engineering challenges were immense. They had to excavate 3,100 tons of earth without creating vibrations. These vibrations might alert East German border guards 300 yards away. They had to shore up the tunnel walls to prevent collapse. They also had to install ventilation systems that would not create detectable air currents at the surface. They had to do all of this in absolute secrecy. This occurred in a city where Soviet and East German intelligence services employed thousands of informants. The solution was ingenious. They disguised the excavation as routine foundation repair work for the warehouse. They transported the excavated soil away in food delivery trucks. The same trucks that brought supplies in carried dirt out, hidden under legitimate cargo. They used electric equipment instead of pneumatic to minimize vibration. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The tunnel advanced at approximately 6 feet per day. Bill Harvey visited the site every week. Sometimes he visited more often. He would climb down into the tunnel and walk its length. He inspected the steel liner sections being installed and checked the ventilation ducts. He carried a Colt .38 revolver in a shoulder holster, always. Harvey trusted no one completely. The tunnel made him paranoid in a productive way. He knew the Soviets had penetrated Western intelligence services before. However, he had personally vetted everyone on the construction team. He had compartmentalized the operation so thoroughly that even Central Intelligence Agency officers in Berlin did not know about the tunnel unless they had a specific need to know. The British were meticulous about security. They used almost no Germans at all, precisely because of infiltration concerns. Harvey did not know that his British liaison, the helpful George Blake, had been effective at coordinating with Secret Intelligence Service technical teams. This same Blake met with Sergei Kondrashev every 6 weeks. Harvey also did not know that Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti files contained not just the tunnel's blueprint. The files also held his own psychological profile, his drinking patterns, and his operational preferences. Even the serial number of his revolver was known. Furthermore, when Harvey walked that tunnel, checking for Soviet awareness, Soviet intelligence was reading reports of his inspections within 48 hours. By February 1955, the tunnel had reached the border. The engineering team faced their most delicate phase. This involved breaking through into East Berlin territory and locating the cable junction. They used a technique called pilot bore. This was a narrow probe drill that could detect obstacles and map subsurface structures before the main tunnel reached them. On February the 25th at 2:30 in the morning, the pilot bore struck the concrete conduit that housed the Soviet cables. They were exactly where British intelligence said they would be, running beneath Schönefelder Chaussee at a depth of 53 feet. Carl Nelson was there when they broke through. The sound changed. The drill bit punching through concrete made a different pitch, sharper and more final. The team widened the breakthrough carefully, exposing the conduit. Inside were 3 main cables. Each was as thick as a man's arm and wrapped in lead sheathing. These cables carried approximately 1,200 communication circuits. These circuits ran between Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst and Moscow. An additional 500 circuits served East German government and military communications. The intercept equipment was already in place. It was installed in a chamber adjacent to the tunnel terminus. This was not crude wiretapping. This was sophisticated signals intelligence technology. It represented some of the most advanced equipment the National Security Agency had ever deployed. The system used non-invasive inductive taps that could read the electromagnetic signatures of conversations passing through the cables. This occurred without physically cutting or splicing the lines. This meant the Soviets would not detect any change in signal quality or impedance. Such a change might indicate tampering, or so the Americans believed. The taps went live on May 11, 1955. Within hours, they were recording Soviet military communications. Translators working in a secure facility in the warehouse basement began transcribing conversations in real time. Within weeks, they were processing 50,000 conversations per month. The intelligence product, designated Regal, had its own distribution list separate from normal Central Intelligence Agency channels because of its sensitivity. Alan Dulles was ecstatic. At a National Security Council meeting in June 1955, he described Operation Gold as an extremely valuable and daring project in Central Intelligence Agency history. The tunnel was delivering exactly what they had hoped. This included operational radio traffic, logistics coordination, and personnel assignments. It also provided personal conversations between Soviet officers that revealed morale problems and equipment failures. President Eisenhower himself received regular briefings on Regal product. In Moscow, the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti read the Central Intelligence Agency's analysis of the tunnel's intelligence take. They read Dulles's assessment. They monitored which Regal reports reached the White House and which stayed at working level. They were, in effect, watching the Central Intelligence Agency watch them. Consequently, they adjusted accordingly. The deception operated on multiple levels simultaneously. First, there was the raw volume of genuine material. The tunnel intercepts were real Soviet military communications, but not the sensitive ones. They captured routine logistics, such as troop movements that were already observable through other means. They also showed equipment transfers that confirmed data from satellite photography. Additionally, they revealed personnel complaints about food quality and inadequate heating in barracks. This material was valuable enough to seem authentic. However, it was mundane enough not to compromise actual Soviet capabilities. Second, there was the strategic deception content. Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti operational planners used the tunnel as a channel for specific disinformation. For example, in August 1955, tunnel intercepts picked up conversations between Soviet officers. They discussed difficulties maintaining their T-54 tank fleet. These included mechanical failures, parts shortages, and inadequate maintenance training. Central Intelligence Agency analysts interpreted this as evidence of Soviet military weakness. What they did not know was that these conversations were deliberate plants. They were designed to obscure the fact that the Soviets had just deployed the T-55, a substantially improved tank design, to units in East Germany. Similarly, tunnel intercepts suggested Soviet air defense radar systems had significant limitations. They struggled in detecting low-altitude aircraft. This intelligence would later factor into American planning for reconnaissance flights. This would also contribute to the strategic miscalculation that led to Gary Powers being shot down over Sverdlovsk in his U-2 in 1960. The Soviet SA-2 missile system that destroyed Powers' aircraft was far more capable. This capability exceeded Central Intelligence Agency estimates based partly on tunnel intelligence. Third, and most sophisticated, was what the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti called intelligence seeding. They used the tunnel to validate deception operations being run elsewhere. For example, if a Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti double agent in West Germany reported that Soviet forces were below strength in a particular sector, the tunnel would intercept conversations that seemed to confirm this. Officers complained about vacant positions. They also made requests for replacement personnel that went unfulfilled. The tunnel became a verification mechanism for lies. This made false intelligence appear multiply-sourced and therefore credible. The operation ran smoothly through 1955 and into 1956. The Central Intelligence Agency established processing protocols for the massive volume of intercept data. Translators worked in shifts, transcribing Russian and German conversations. Analysts wrote reports that circulated to the State Department, the Pentagon, and the National Security Council. The tunnel became a reliable source within the intelligence infrastructure, shaping American understanding of Soviet military capabilities and intentions. Bill Harvey ran the operation with obsessive attention to security. The tunnel crew rotated every 6 months to prevent anyone from knowing too much. The intercept chamber was accessible only to personnel with special clearances. Even Central Intelligence Agency officers in Berlin were not told about the tunnel's exact location. They knew it existed, but they did not know where. Harvey was protecting against Soviet penetration. He was doing everything right, except for George Blake. Blake attended every significant planning meeting. He reviewed security protocols. He knew the rotation schedules, the communication procedures, and the location of backup sites in case the tunnel was discovered. And every 6 to 8 weeks, he met with Kondrashev. He then transferred his knowledge to Moscow. By early 1956, Blake had been promoted within the Secret Intelligence Service. He was being considered for more senior positions, possibly a station chief role. His career was ascending, and he was trusted. He was effective, and he was systematically betraying every operation he touched. However, the Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности faced a growing problem. How long could they maintain the charade? The tunnel had been operational for nearly 1 year. Central Intelligence Agency confidence in the intelligence product was absolute, but the longer the operation continued, the greater the risk that someone might realize something was wrong. This could be an analyst looking at anomalies, or a field officer noticing patterns. The strategic value of Blake as an agent in place had to be weighed against the operational risk of the tunnel. In January 1956, Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности chairman SROV met again with his operational directorate. They reviewed the costs and benefits. The tunnel was successfully channeling disinformation to the Americans. However, the margin for error was shrinking. The Central Intelligence Agency was beginning to make operational decisions based on tunnel intelligence. If those decisions succeeded in ways the Soviets had not anticipated, it might force Moscow to reveal that they had known about the tunnel all along. This would point toward a high-level penetration of Anglo-American intelligence. Protecting Blake required ending the tunnel. This had to be done in a way that appeared natural and accidental. It could not possibly indicate a leak in the planning stage. The solution was elegant. They would blame the weather. Berlin's winter from 1955 to 1956 was harsh. Heavy snow in January gave way to freezing rain in February. The soil was saturated. On March 15th, Soviet engineers in East Berlin reported that rainfall was causing subsidence problems along Schönefeld Air Chaussee. This was real. The water table had risen and was destabilizing the roadbed. Standard procedure required inspecting underground infrastructure in the affected area. This included the cable conduits. The Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности saw their opportunity. On March 22nd, they authorized East German post and telegraph workers to conduct a routine inspection of cable conduits beneath Schönefeld Air Chaussee. The inspection team would naturally discover the tunnel. The discovery would appear completely coincidental, just bad luck for the Americans. It would be the unfortunate consequence of unusually wet weather causing infrastructure problems that required investigation. On April 21st, 1956. At 7:30 in the evening, East German cable repair technicians opened a maintenance access point on Schönefeld Air Chaussee. They were investigating water seepage into the conduit system. What they found was the American tap chamber, a sophisticated room carved into the earth and filled with electronic equipment. Cables ran back toward West Berlin from this room. They immediately notified Soviet military command. Within hours, Soviet troops cordoned off the area. They excavated the tunnel entrance on the East German side. They photographed everything meticulously, including the intercept equipment, the ventilation systems, and the electrical installations. They found the aluminum ladder leading back toward the American sector. At 11:15 in the evening, they cut the cables, severing the American intercept. In the basement of the R.O. Udau warehouse, Bill Harvey was reviewing transcripts. Then every monitor went dead simultaneously. For one frozen second, he did not move. He did not breathe. Then he hit the emergency alarm and initiated the destruction protocol. Staff began shredding documents, smashing hard drives and preparing to evacuate. But Harvey knew it was over. He felt an absolute certainty. The worst-case scenario had finally arrived. 11 months and 11 days of intercept had passed. Now the Soviets knew. What Harvey did not know, and could not possibly know, as he stood in that suddenly silent chamber, was that the Soviets had known before he had turned the first shovel of earth. Every piece of intelligence he had collected had been choreographed. His great triumph was someone else's operation entirely. The next morning, April 22, Soviet military command in Karlshorst, pronounced K-A-H-R-L-S, Horst, invited Western journalists to tour the tunnel. This was a propaganda spectacular. Soviet officers guided reporters through the intercept chamber. They pointed out the sophisticated American equipment and the comfortable working conditions, including a coffee maker. They also highlighted the elaborate security measures. East German newspapers ran front-page stories, claiming American aggressors were caught red-handed. Soviet news outlets called it proof of American aggression and a violation of East German sovereignty. Western media, surprisingly, celebrated this discovery. The New York Times ran the story with barely concealed pride. They reported that the United States tunnel had tapped Soviet lines for 1 year. Newsweek called it an intelligence coup. The consensus in the Western press was clear. The tunnel had been discovered, but only after providing nearly 1 year of valuable intelligence. The operation was presented as a success. It was daring and technically brilliant. Although compromised eventually, it was productive while it lasted. Alan Dulles played it perfectly. At a press conference, he neither confirmed nor denied the Central Intelligence Agency's involvement. However, he allowed that such operations were necessary in Cold War intelligence gathering. Privately, he told President Eisenhower that the tunnel's discovery was regrettable. Despite this, the intelligence product had been invaluable. The president agreed with this assessment. Operation Gold entered Central Intelligence Agency law as a triumph of technical ingenuity. It was a rare victory in the murky world of Berlin espionage. Only one person in the Western intelligence community suspected something deeper. His name was William King Harvey. Late at night, while reviewing the timeline, something bothered him. The Soviet response had been too organized and too ready for cameras. The discovery also seemed too convenient. However, Harvey had no evidence, just intuition. In intelligence work, intuition without evidence is just paranoia. He filed his concerns in a memorandum that was classified and forgotten. In Moscow, Sergei Kondrashev, pronounced Kondrashev, added the press clippings to the Operation Gold file. Western journalists had done exactly what the Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности hoped. They portrayed the tunnel as an American success. They did not question why Soviet counterintelligence had failed to detect it for nearly 1 year. The narrative was set. It highlighted Central Intelligence Agency ingenuity versus eventual Soviet vigilance. Nobody asked the question that truly mattered. How had the Americans tapped cables for 11 months without Soviet communication security noticing anything unusual? George Blake continued his career with the Secret Intelligence Service. He received commendations for his work on the Berlin tunnel operation. His technical expertise had been valuable during planning. He was posted to Lebanon and then returned to London. He was trusted, valued, and successful. He also continued meeting his Soviet handlers, passing them the crown jewels of British intelligence. The Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности's greatest achievement was not discovering the tunnel. Instead, it was making the West believe the tunnel had ever been a secret at all. The truth began to unravel on April 4, 1961. This was 5 years after the tunnel was discovered. George Blake was in his office at Military Intelligence, Section 6 headquarters, reviewing files. 2 special branch officers entered and asked him to come with them. He was driven to a safe house in the suburbs. There, over the next 8 hours, interrogators confronted him with evidence. This evidence had accumulated over months of investigation. A Soviet defector had provided crucial clues. Traffic analysis of intelligence leaks had pointed towards someone with Blake's access. Under questioning, Blake's composure began to fracture. By midnight, he had confessed to everything. The scope of his betrayal was staggering. Blake had compromised dozens of operations. He had identified hundreds of agents and caused many deaths. However, the revelation that shattered the Central Intelligence Agency's institutional pride came on April 18. This occurred when Blake's debriefers asked him specifically about the Berlin Tunnel. They asked when he had told the Soviets. Blake's answer was simple: before construction began. He had reported the entire operation, including blueprints, timeline, and personnel, to his Komitet Gosudastvenoi Bezopasnosti handler in April 1954. This was 5 months before the first excavation. The Central Intelligence Agency received this information in a classified memo from Military Intelligence, Section 6, on April 22, 1961. This was exactly 5 years to the day after the tunnel's discovery. For Alan Dulles, now in the final months of his tenure as Director of Central Intelligence, the revelation was devastating. The operation he had cited as proof of the Central Intelligence Agency's technical superiority had been compromised from inception. Every piece of intelligence, every analysis, and every briefing to the President was potentially contaminated by Soviet deception. Bill Harvey was in Rome when he learned the truth. He was serving as Central Intelligence Agency station chief at the time. According to colleagues who saw him that day, he sat silent for several minutes after reading the cable from headquarters. Then he locked his office door. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing his personal files on the tunnel operation, looking for the signs he had missed. He never spoke publicly about his reaction. However, associates later said the revelation changed him. It made him more suspicious and more isolated. He became less willing to trust human intelligence sources. The tunnel he had built became the symbol of a deeper failure. It was not just that they had been deceived, but that they had never suspected. The immediate question was how much damage had been done. The Central Intelligence Agency convened a special review team to audit every intelligence report derived from tunnel intercepts. This team was codenamed Avarice. They worked for 8 months, cross-referencing tunnel intelligence against data from other sources. These sources included satellite photography, human intelligence, and signals intercept from other locations. Their findings were grim. Approximately 40% of tunnel intelligence had been genuine but non-sensitive material. This included logistical communications and administrative traffic. None of it compromised Soviet operational capabilities. Another 35% was real intelligence. However, Soviet planners had determined this data was acceptable for Americans to know. This included troop dispositions that were visible anyway, equipment types already catalogued through other collection methods, and personnel issues that did not affect operational readiness. This material made the tunnel seem productive without actually revealing anything Moscow considered critical. The remaining 25% was the poison. This involved strategic deception content designed to mislead Central Intelligence Agency analysis of Soviet capabilities. The Avarice team identified at least 17 major analytical judgments. These judgments had been influenced by tunnel intelligence. They were now suspected of being manipulated. This included assessments of Soviet air defense capabilities, tank force readiness, nuclear weapons deployment timelines, and strategic missile development. Some of these judgments had informed National Security Council decisions about American military posture and weapons development. The most troubling finding concerned verification and confidence. The tunnel had tapped direct Soviet military communications. This meant the adversary was talking to itself, not to the Americans. Therefore, analysts had treated the intelligence as highly reliable. When other intelligence sources contradicted tunnel intercepts, analysts frequently dismissed these contradictions. They saw them as errors in the other sources. They did not question the tunnel product itself. The tunnel had created a kind of confirmation bias. Analysts believed the intelligence because it seemed impossible that the Soviets could manipulate their own communications at such a large scale. However, that was exactly what they had done. The Avarice report was completed in December 1961. It was classified Top Secret Umbra. This report was distributed to exactly 14 people. Its conclusion was carefully worded but unmistakable. The Berlin Tunnel operation, while demonstrating American technical proficiency, was operationally compromised from inception. Intelligence product derived from tunnel intercepts should be regarded as strategically unreliable. The extent to which Soviet deception operations successfully influenced American policy decisions remained under assessment. Alan Dulles had resigned as Director of Central Intelligence in November 1961. He was officially retiring, but in reality was forced out after the Bay of Pigs disaster. He never spoke publicly about the tunnel compromise. In private, he told former colleagues that Blake's betrayal was the worst penetration since Philby, pronounced Philby. This referred to Kim Philby, a British intelligence officer who had also spied for Moscow. Philby's own betrayals had devastated Anglo-American operations in the 1950s. However, unlike Philby, Blake had corrupted more than just individual operations. He had corrupted the very foundation of intelligence itself. This included the confidence that intercepts of enemy communications revealed truth. George Blake went to trial in May 1961. The proceedings were held partly in camera, meaning they were closed to the public. This was due to the sensitivity of the operations he had compromised. He was convicted on 5 counts of espionage. He was sentenced to 42 years in prison. This was an extraordinary sentence that reflected the scale of his betrayal. The judge, Lord Parker, described Blake's actions as having endangered the lives of many people. He also stated that Blake had caused incalculable harm to British and Allied interests. Blake showed no remorse. In a statement to the court, he said he had acted according to his conscience and his commitment to communist ideology. But Blake did not serve his 42 years. On October 22, 1966, he escaped from Wormwood Scrubbs prison in London. Wormwood Scrubbs is pronounced Wormwood Scrubs. The escape was sophisticated. A ladder appeared at the prison wall at precisely the right moment. A car waited exactly where it was needed. Within 48 hours, Blake had been smuggled through Europe into East Germany. He then went to Moscow. British intelligence suspected Komitet Gosudastvenoi Bezopasnosti involvement in the escape but could never prove it. Blake was welcomed in Moscow as a hero. He was given an apartment, a pension, and work as a lecturer in espionage tradecraft at Komitet Gosudastvenoi Bezopasnosti schools. He lived in Moscow for the rest of his life. He survived the Soviet collapse and continued into the Russian Federation era. In interviews with Western journalists in the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, Blake spoke openly about his work for the Komitet Gosudastvenoi Bezopasnosti. He confirmed he had betrayed the tunnel operation from the start. He estimated he had compromised more than 400 Western agents. He expressed no regret. He told one interviewer that he did not regret anything. He acted according to his convictions, he stated. George Blake died in Moscow on December 26, 2020. He was age 98. He had spent 54 years as a celebrated defector in the country he had served in secret. For the Central Intelligence Agency officers who had worked on Operation Gold, Blake's confirmed betrayal and subsequent escape felt like a double wound. First, there was the revelation that their greatest operation had been compromised. Then, there was the failure to hold the man who had compromised it accountable. Bill Harvey died in 1976 at age 60. His death was due to heart disease, exacerbated by years of heavy drinking. Colleagues said the tunnel's compromise had haunted him. They believed he had never fully recovered from learning the truth. He left behind operational notes and memoirs that were classified until 2007. In one passage, written in 1974, Harvey reflected on the tunnel. He wrote that they built something magnificent and believed they were winning. He concluded that the worst kind of defeat is the one you do not know you have suffered. He felt they lost before they began and celebrated all the way to the end. The tunnel itself remained intact, sealed on both sides. In East Berlin, Soviet authorities filled the intercept chamber with concrete and posted guards. In West Berlin, the warehouse continued operating as a commissary facility until 1972. The vertical shaft was sealed and forgotten. After German reunification in 1990, the tunnel became a historical curiosity. The East Berlin entrance was partially excavated and turned into a small museum. This museum, known as the Berlin Tunnel Museum, or The Tunnel, opened in 2006. Visitors can explore it today. They can see the intercept chamber, now preserved with its vintage equipment. Visitors can also walk a section of the original tunnel. A placard explains Operation Gold. It describes the operation as an ambitious American intelligence effort. This effort functioned for 11 months before its discovery by Soviet forces in April 1956. The placard does not mention key details, however. Those 11 months were a carefully orchestrated theatre. The discovery was scheduled by the Soviets. The entire operation existed as a deception orchestrated by the Committee for State Security. Some truths remain too complex for simple museum placards. The strategic impact of the tunnel's compromise rippled through the Central Intelligence Agency for decades. The immediate effect was institutional paranoia about penetrations. If George Blake could compromise the Berlin Tunnel, the agency questioned what else had been betrayed. They wondered how many other operations were actually Soviet manipulations. The Central Intelligence Agency's counterintelligence staff, led by James Angleton, launched a series of internal investigations. These investigations consumed enormous resources throughout the 1960s. Angleton became convinced that the agency was riddled with Soviet moles. His investigations paralyzed operations and destroyed careers. They also created a culture of suspicion that persisted long after his forced retirement in 1974. The tunnel specifically changed how the Central Intelligence Agency evaluated signals intelligence. After the Avarice Report, a new doctrine emerged. Intercepts of adversary communications could no longer be automatically trusted as reliable. If the Soviets could manipulate their own communications infrastructure at scale, maintaining operational security for sensitive traffic was possible. They could also feed deception content through channels they knew were tapped. Therefore, signals intelligence required the same kind of source validation as human intelligence. This was revolutionary for intelligence practices. Signals intelligence had always been considered inherently more reliable than human intelligence. This was because it was supposedly unmediated, the enemy talking to itself. However, the tunnel's compromise proved that assumption false. This doctrinal shift had practical consequences for intelligence agencies. The Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency developed new methodologies. These methods helped validate signals intelligence through independent channels. They invested heavily in satellite photography and other technical collection systems. These systems could not be manipulated as easily as communications. Agencies became more cautious about basing policy recommendations solely on intercepts. The tunnel taught them that the most dangerous intelligence seemed perfect. This perfect intelligence confirmed what they hoped to learn. It came from a source they believed the enemy did not know about. The tunnel also changed how Soviet intelligence operated. The success of the deception operation convinced the Committee for State Security. They believed Western intelligence agencies could be manipulated systematically through carefully controlled information channels. This method became a model for subsequent operations. Throughout the Cold War, the Committee for State Security and the Main Intelligence Directorate ran multiple deception programs. These programs fed false or misleading information to Western intelligence services. The information flowed through channels the West believed were secure. Some of these operations were tactical, compromising specific agents or missions. Others were strategic, shaping American perceptions of Soviet military capabilities, political intentions, or economic conditions. Historians now recognize that much of what Western intelligence believed about the Soviet Union was influenced by Soviet deception operations. The Berlin Tunnel stands as an early and successful example of this. This does not mean everything was false. The Soviet Union truly collapsed in 1991. It was indeed economically dysfunctional. It truly lost the arms race. However, the timing, specific capabilities, and operational readiness of Soviet forces were different. These assessments were shaped by intelligence that the Soviets had opportunities to manipulate. The tunnel taught them how effective such manipulation could be. The Soviets learned this lesson thoroughly. Technologically, the tunnel operation had mixed legacies. On one hand, it demonstrated that sophisticated technical intelligence operations were possible even in denied territory. The engineering achievement was real. Engineers built a 1,500-foot tunnel in hostile territory. They tapped cables without detection, or so they believed. They operated an intercept system for nearly 1 year. These capabilities would inform later operations. This included tunneling projects in other locations during the Cold War. It also included technical surveillance operations that remained classified. On the other hand, the tunnel showed the limits of technical intelligence without complementary human intelligence. The Central Intelligence Agency had no human sources inside the Committee for State Security. Such sources could have warned them about the compromise. George Blake operated undetected for 9 years from 1951 to 1961. This occurred precisely because Western counterintelligence relied too heavily on operational security procedures. It did not rely enough on human vetting and investigation. The assumption was that if procedures were followed, operations would be secure. Blake proved that assumption fatally wrong. He had access because he was trusted. He was trusted because he had followed the right career path and said the right things. No technical security measure could prevent betrayal by someone with legitimate access. The human cost of George Blake's betrayal extended far beyond the tunnel. Historians estimate that his intelligence led to the compromise and execution of at least 40 agents. These agents operated inside the Soviet bloc. These individuals had risked everything to provide information to the West. They included scientists, military officers, and party functionaries. Many had become disillusioned with communism. Blake identified them through his access to operational files. The Committee for State Security arrested them quietly. They interrogated the agents to understand what had been revealed. Then the Committee for State Security executed them. Their families were also punished. They were sent to labor camps, denied education and employment. Families were marked as relatives of traitors. Blake's 9 years of espionage created a generational tragedy. This tragedy affected hundreds of people directly and thousands indirectly. In the specific case of the Berlin Tunnel, we do not know if anyone died directly. This is due to the compromised intelligence. The deception was sophisticated enough that the Soviets did not need to kill people to protect it. They simply managed what information flowed through the tap. However, the strategic consequences of misled American policy decisions are impossible to calculate fully. These decisions were based partly on tunnel intelligence. Did false assessments of Soviet air defense capabilities lead to failed reconnaissance missions? Did misleading intelligence about Soviet military readiness affect American force posture? Did this prolong the Cold War or increase nuclear risks? These are questions without definitive answers. The fact that we must ask them demonstrates the tunnel's dark legacy. One specific consequence is documentable. In 1960, the Central Intelligence Agency planned Gary Powers' U-2 flight over Sverdlovsk. One factor in their risk assessment was intelligence about Soviet air defense capabilities. This intelligence was derived partly from Berlin Tunnel intercepts. Those intercepts had suggested Soviet radar and missile systems had limitations at high altitude. The assessment proved catastrophically wrong. Powers was shot down at 70,000 feet and captured. He became the center of a diplomatic crisis. This crisis destroyed the Paris summit and worsened United States-Soviet relations. While the tunnel was not the only source for those intelligence judgments, it contributed to a fatal overconfidence. This overconfidence was in American technical superiority and Soviet limitations. After the Cold War ended, researchers gained access to some Soviet archives. Documents revealed that the Committee for State Security considered Operation Gold one of their most successful active measures. Operation Gold was their code name for the tunnel deception. Internal Committee for State Security assessments credited the operation with successfully misleading American intelligence on multiple fronts. It also protected George Blake for 5 additional years after he might otherwise have been exposed. A Committee for State Security internal memorandum from 1957, declassified in 1998, confirmed the value of strategic patience in counterintelligence. By allowing the adversary's operation to proceed under controlled conditions, they achieved results impossible through simple interdiction. That memorandum was written by Sergei Kondrashev, George Blake's handler. Kondrashev retired from the Committee for State Security in 1980 as a major general. He had spent his career in counterintelligence operations. After the Soviet collapse, he gave interviews to Western researchers. In a 1998 conversation with Central Intelligence Agency historian David Bahoj, Kondrashev was asked about his moral qualms. He was asked about the tunnel deception and the broader consequences of Blake's espionage. His answer was illuminating. He explained that they were at war, not a shooting war, but war nonetheless. Kondrashev stated that in war, deception is strategy, not betrayal. He added that the Western side built the tunnel to deceive them, but they simply deceived the West better. When asked about the agents executed because of Blake's intelligence, Kondrashev's response was blunt. He said they were traitors to their country. He added that the Soviets treated them as such, and the Western side would have done the same. Sergei Kondrashev died in Moscow in 2007. His obituary in Russian military journals praised his contribution to defending the Soviet homeland. This defense occurred during the period of ideological struggle. Western intelligence historians who knew his work had a different assessment. They considered him one of the most effective counterintelligence officers of the Cold War. For them, the Berlin Tunnel was his masterpiece. In the end, the Berlin Tunnel operation asks more questions than it answers. How much of what Western intelligence believed during the Cold War was real? How much was carefully crafted Soviet deception designed to be believed? If an intelligence service does not know it is deceived, is it truly gathering intelligence? Or is it simply being fed a script? The tunnel itself sleeps beneath Berlin, sealed and silent. Visitors can visit the museum entrance on Schönefelder Chaussee. This is now a quiet street in reunified Germany. The border fortifications are just a memory here. Visitors can descend into the intercept chamber, preserved exactly as it was in 1956. It contains racks of American electronics and improvised chairs. Analysts sat there, transcribing conversations they believed were secret. A coffee maker sits on a shelf, rusted but intact. Someone left it there when they evacuated the site. No one ever came back for it. The exhibits tell the story as it was understood then. They describe an ambitious American operation, a technical success, an eventual discovery. This discovery was made by vigilant Soviet counterintelligence. The timeline on the wall ends in April 1956, with the tunnel's exposure. A footnote was added after the museum was updated in 2007. It mentions that subsequent information revealed the operation had been compromised by a Soviet agent in British intelligence. However, the footnote does not explain what that meant. It does not convey that the entire operation was theatre. It does not convey that 11 months of intelligence was choreographed. It does not convey that the triumph was someone else's plan. Most visitors take photographs, examine the equipment, and leave thinking they have seen evidence of American ingenuity during the Cold War. They have not. What they have seen is a monument to the perfect lie. This lie was so good that even after its exposure, people still did not quite believe it was false. The tunnel was not discovered in April 1956. It was concluded. Its purpose fulfilled, it was time to end the operation. This allowed them to score propaganda points. These points would obscure the deception itself. George Blake's wristwatch is in a museum in London. It is part of an espionage exhibition. This British military-issue timepiece was worn by him during his years as a secret intelligence service officer. The watch stopped working in 1966, around the time of his escape. No one wound it again. It shows 3:47. This time means nothing and everything. It is frozen at the moment when Blake's double life ended. At this moment, his single Soviet life began. However, it is also frozen at the moment when Western intelligence might have asked itself a crucial question. Were other operations and other certainties equally false? They did not ask, not systematically. The institutional need to believe in success was too strong. The Berlin Tunnel remained in Central Intelligence Agency histories as a triumph. It was footnoted as later compromised. However, it was fundamentally presented as an operational success. Even after the AH-VAR-RIS report, even after Blake's confession, and even after Soviet archives opened, the tunnel retained its status. It remained proof of American technical superiority. The truth never quite took hold. This truth was that it reflected Soviet operational superiority. It also revealed deception at a scale Western intelligence had never imagined. In 2019, the National Security Agency declassified the final volume of tunnel-related documents. These documents included the complete AH-VAR-RIS report. Researchers had been requesting these files for decades. When they finally came out, heavily redacted but readable, the response from the intelligence community was muted. A few historians wrote articles. Some former Central Intelligence Agency officers gave interviews to specialized publications. However, there was no major reassessment. There was no institutional reckoning with what the tunnel really represented. Perhaps that is the final victory of Operation Gold. This was the Soviet name for it. The name survived both communism and Russian Federation changes. It persisted in archives as the designation for the American tunnel. They controlled this tunnel from its inception. The greatest deception is not the lie you tell. It is the lie you tell so well that even after its exposure, even after everyone knows it was false, people still cannot quite accept what it means. They cannot accept what it means about everything else they believe. The coffee maker on the shelf in the Tunnel Museum is the most honest artifact there. Someone left it behind in April 1956. They were thinking they would return. They thought the silence was temporary. It was a setback, but not a defeat. They never came back because there was nothing to come back to. The intelligence operation they believed in had never existed. They had been brewing coffee in the theatre, working night shifts in the fiction, and transcribing the script someone else had written. That coffee maker, rusted and empty, is still waiting for someone to fill it again. It is still waiting for the operation to resume. It is also still waiting for the day when the tunnel was real.